Hello Astro subscribers, and before I start this video, I do want to let you know that I am definitely working on finishing up the Planetary Lords Through Houses series. And before I get done with all of that, I wanted to branch out into another area of astrology, which is basically analyzing how you can see how beliefs emerge out of a star chart. And I figured who better to analyze the charts of first than some of the people who offer the absolute worst criticisms against astrology and really all abstract, non-materialistic, non-empirical belief systems. And I am referring to the so-called self-titled Four Horsemen of the Atheist Apocalypse, which is a really, really interesting name because, they're basically identifying with mythological figures from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And, I just find that telling. But anyway, I wanted to look at an analysis of the four most famous atheists in modern times charts, and I wanted to not use that to explain away or reduce their beliefs to some astrological causal factor, but I wanted to actually understand, okay, what are the motivations for them believing this? And so basically, if you want to look at motivations for somebody's belief system, the best way to go about doing that is to look at the chain of dispositors in their chart. So let's use Christopher Hitchens' chart as an example. Okay, so he's got Sun in Aries, Moon in Libra, Mercury in Aries, Venus in Aries, Mars in Aries, Jupiter in Capricorn, and Saturn in Leo. So let's take the Sun as an example. So the Sun is in Aries, and then you chase that back to Mars because Mars is the ruler of Aries. And you then find that Mars is also in Aries, and that creates a loop, so you can just sort of file that away. It's like, okay, the end of the dispositor chain there is Mars. And if you do that with, let's say, his moon sign, which is Libra, which is ruled by Venus, you chase that back to Venus because Venus rules Libra. You get Venus in Aries. You chase that back to Mars, and you get Mars fueling that chain as well. You can actually chase everything in Christopher Hitchens' chart back to Mars in Aries. So if you look at the root of his belief system, like the root of his neural network, his decision-making process, what does he refer to when he's making his decisions in large part? It's going to ultimately, everything is going to come back to Mars. And I was looking at Christopher Hitchens' life. Unfortunately, he's passed away. Even though I don't agree with them, obviously condolences to everybody who knew him and his family and whatnot. I'm not here to, gloat. We're all going to pass. But I'm just here to give an analysis and use an example of somebody who didn't agree with astrology to see how astrology shaped the course of their life and their beliefs. So just to show that it applies to everybody to some extent. All right, so when you look at Hitchens compared to the other four horsemen, or the four most famous living atheists, well, with the exception of Hitchens himself, he is the most polemic, and polemic basically means the most contrarian, the most aggressive, the most, he identifies mostly as a critic, as a person who is trying to frustrate the opponent into submission. He's probably the least reasonable of the four horsemen as well. And that makes sense if you think about the fact that his chart is very warlike. I mean, it's a war of ideas. He's not trying to convince people, he's trying to ridicule them and to sort of poke fun at them as a, kind of almost a comedian, but also an aggressor and an agitator and somebody who pokes holes and destroys things that he believes to be corrupt. In fact, all of the four horsemen, interestingly enough, have Sun in Aries. And I find that to be incredibly interesting. That was the first big comparison, or the first big similarity I found in their chart, that they all have an exalted Sun, meaning they all are very strongly identified with the hero archetype, the protagonist archetype. They're very strongly independent. They believe in the power of the human will over any other thing, and they believe that if you have some extra force that's more powerful than humans, then that probably takes away from their own ability to be independent. And, I've got Sun in the first house personally, and I identify with that pretty strongly as well. It's a very interesting thing. So anyway, Hitchens' chart is fairly simple to analyze because he is basically driven by being a polemic. In some ways, that's the easiest chart to look at. Now, the next chart I want to look at here, I've got them all written down, is Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins is far more intellectual than Christopher Hitchens. He's an accomplished biologist, an accomplished researcher. He's written several books that were game-changing for biology and evolutionary theory. He wrote The Selfish Gene. And so Richard Dawkins' star chart, it traces back to Jupiter, and as opposed to Christopher Hitchens' chart tracing back to Mars, which means that Dawkins, as opposed to being a polemic, as opposed to being an agitator, he is going to be a truth seeker, a person who believes in seeking out education, seeking out wisdom. And his Jupiter is in Taurus, which lends itself toward materialistic explanations of things. Taurus is probably the most materialistic sign, I would say. It is the simplest sign, not to call Richard Dawkins simple, because he's certainly not, but it is the most... Taurus prefers simple explanations to things. It prefers material explanations. It's very sensory. It likes to be able to touch everything that it experiences. And one thing that's interesting about Taurus is that Pisces falls into the 11th place from Taurus, which means that Pisces, which is the abstract, the spiritual, probably the most abstract and spiritual sign, relating to all the things that you cannot see, it falls into a very materialistic house, which is the house of Aquarius, which is the house of science, systems improvement, making things more efficient, social change. And so for Taurus, the most spiritual thing in life, in general, is the Aquarius archetype, which is the archetype of, again, social change and engineering and making things better and making things improve, making things run smoother in the material plane. So that is very interesting. But also, Dawkins has a Venus in Pisces. So even though his chart mostly traces back to Jupiter, it's a toss-up between what's more powerful in his chart, Jupiter in Taurus or Venus in Pisces. And one thing that's interesting about Venus in Pisces is, yes, Pisces is a very spiritual sign, a very abstract sign, so you would expect Dawkins to be all like spiritual and new agey and abstract and religious, right? Well, not necessarily, because his Venus in Pisces is at 29 degrees. And when a sign is at 29 degrees, or a planet is at 29 degrees in a sign, what tends to happen is its standards elevate exceptionally high. And so, for instance, somebody with Jupiter at 29 degrees, they're not going to be able to be convinced by shallow religious arguments. So what I see in Dawkins is a person who prefers materialistic explanations for seeking truth. He's interested in truth, and he could believe in religion if somebody, or spirituality, if somebody gave him a good enough explanation. But because people who can give good accounts of religious sentiments are exceptionally rare, he probably hasn't ever come across anybody who's been able to convince him, because his standards are just so high, and he already has that preference for materialistic and explanations that he can touch and see and feel, which is fine. I mean, he's given a lot to the field of biology because of that. But I'm not trying to judge anybody's beliefs here. I'm just trying to give an explanation for why the beliefs seem to manifest in their life. All right, so next I want to talk about Sam Harris. Now, Sam Harris has been some recent controversy based on American politics, but I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm mostly going to look at his astrology chart and what motivates him to do what he does. Now, Sam Harris is a really interesting character because he has this weird sort of yoga practice that he does with meditation, and he's very into oneness, but he's also claims to be an atheist. So he kind of has a foot in both worlds. And I think by looking at his chart, we're going to be able to see exactly why that is. So, like Hitchens, he's got quite a few Aries placements. He's got the same Mercury placement as Richard Dawkins, which is Mercury in Pisces. But instead of Hitchens going back to Mars in Aries, his Mars is actually in Libra. And you chase that back from Libra to Venus. His Venus is in Taurus. So again, we have this desire for materialistic explanations. We have a person who is indeed a polemic, but he's very low-key, because when Aries gets its power from Libra, Libra is a sign, it's a agitating sign, it's a polemic sign, but it's not going to be in your face. Libra is a very feminine, masculine type sign. So what it's going to do is argue in a very feminine way, archetypally. It's going to be subversive. It's going to use argumentation. It's going to try to get up under your skin in a very calm and level way. And that's exactly what Sam Harris does. He's very good at it, actually. I almost admire his subversiveness in the pursuit of materialistic explanations for things. But that doesn't really answer the part about why he's the only one of these four horsemen who has this weird sort of spiritual meditative yoga practice on the side. And Sam Harris actually has an exalted Jupiter placement. He's got Jupiter in Cancer. And I think that's why he kind of has a foot in both worlds. But again, his Jupiter Cancer feeds into his moon in Aries, which feeds into his polemic nature, and then that goes back to the Mars in Libra, which is subversive and whatnot. And so he's got this weird spiritual, egoless, free will doesn't exist. But then he also has this like weird materialistic thing. And this is a person who you can see has a very clear split in his ethical statement, because he's got an exalted Jupiter, which lends him towards spiritual experiences, psychedelic experiences. Jupiter is going to force him to engage with that world, but the rest of his chart is very explicitly materialistic, and that is going to explain why he has this spiritual edge, but he also has this materialistic explanation. He always seeks materialistic explanations for his spiritual beliefs. And finally, Daniel Dennett. The chart of him it's different than the other ones, and that actually makes sense because Daniel Dennett is actually a qualitatively different person. He's actually a philosopher primarily. He's best known for his books on why consciousness doesn't exist, interestingly enough. So he's a free will denier. He's a consciousness denier. So he's very materialistic, but he's also a philosopher, which seems like somewhat of a contradiction, but, whatever, maybe not. And with Dennett, the two things that end his dispositor chains in his chart are a Jupiter in Gemini, hence the success through writing, and a Mercury in Pisces, philosophy, essentially, and spirituality, square there. So he's got a Jupiter-Mercury square, which is interesting, because Jupiter is perception and Mercury is cognition and thought. And so a Gemini-Pisces square is an exceptionally abstract square. These people, the main problem with this square is they actually tend to get lost in thought, as opposed to the other square that ends his dispositor chains in his chart. So he's got two endings to his chains, two separate chains with two different endings. One of them is that Jupiter in Gemini, Mercury in Pisces, the getting lost in thought, getting lost in abstraction, philosophizing, having a contradiction between perception and his thought process, what he sees and what he thinks, is in conflict because it's a square. But the other thing is a Taurus Aquarius square between Saturn and Venus. So this is a very interesting square because basically Venus in Aquarius, or just Aquarius in general, gains a large part of its power from both Uranus and Saturn. So when you're looking at where Uranus and Saturn are, if you've got Taurus influencing Aquarius, what happens basically is because Aquarius is debilitated in Taurus, these people tend to go a little bit haywire in their desire for social reform and revolution. So because Taurus likes simple, comfortable explanations and material explanations that it can see, taste, and touch, and Aquarius wants to change the world, what you get is a revolutionary who sees things in black and white. And that's why Venus in Aquarius and Taurus or Saturn in Taurus, or a Aquarius-Taurus square in general, can be very self-destructive because it has this desire for social change and reform and systems reform, but it also has this weird desire to keep everything as simple as possible. And that's, I think, where you could get a person who is a reductionist. Now, if you combine that with a Gemini Pisces square, what you get is a philosopher who is essentially a reductionist and who has this scientific bent on philosophy, but also wants things to be as simple and material as possible. And I think that's accurately characterizes Daniel Dennett's contribution to science and philosophy. Is very reductionist. He tends to get lost in abstraction, and he wants everything to be as simple as possible, but he also believes that making everything as simple as possible will ultimately change things for the better. So anyway, that was an analysis of the probably foremost living, again with the unfortunate exception of Christopher Hitchens, the foremost living atheists and critics of astrology, an analysis of their chart and how the systems, the chains of thought that are present in their star charts very clearly shaped their perceptions, their rationalizations, their logic. There's this thing under the surface that is driving these people to be who they are. And, you can make of that what you will. I'm sure if some people have some criticisms or you think I missed something or don't provide enough evidence for this, feel free to let me know in the comments. But I thought this was an exceptionally interesting take, and also a vehicle for understanding how to gather information about why people's beliefs emerge in the way that they do from their natal charts. So anyway, signing out, have a good day, and I will try to get that 11th and 12th Lords video out as soon as I can. All right, have a good one.